As the 20th century began, the great powers of Europe would carve up Asia and the Pacific into their own spheres. Germany, Russia, France, and Britain would clearly carve out their own territories, areas of economic operation, and zones of influence. Many of the Chinese, seeing that they were no longer truly sovereign in their own realm, would harbor steep resentments toward this. Anti-foreign movements would begin to form. One quite prominent phenomenon was the rise of martial arts societies. Facing bleak economic conditions, the encroachment of foreign influence and power, and in particular, the presence of foreign missionaries, groups would begin to form to more closely study their traditional culture, rally in opposition to the foreign presence, and to practice martial arts. Because of how intertwined martial arts was with these societies, they would earn the name Boxers. Beginning in 1898, Boxers in Shandong would begin attacking Chinese Christians, attacking missionaries, destroying foreign property, and increasingly physically assert themselves against the European presence. Initially, the Qing government in Shandong would be quite hands-off. They would even show a degree of support for the Boxers, believing that it may be useful in driving out foreign presence, and so this movement would grow and become more aggressive. In the latter months of 1899, Boxers would attack villages and kill Chinese Christians. The Qing governor in Shandong, Yu Deling, would be removed from his position for showing too much lenience and allowing this to happen. His replacement, Yuan Shikai, would be far less lenient and begin cracking down on the Boxers. Yet, as 1900 began, these attacks had become a large-scale rebellion. They would continue to advance, killing missionaries and destroying infrastructure, and they would make their way toward Beijing. The rebellion would spread to Hebei, and considerations as to how to address this would become quite a significant and divisive topic within the Qing court. The more traditionalist, including the Empress Dowager Cixi, would align themselves with the Boxers, believing that bold action was needed to drive out the foreign presence, while the reformists, those who had been looking toward Western techniques and ideas, believed that this was a disruptive element and should be stopped. And by June of that year, the Boxers would cut off telegraph lines and railways, isolating Beijing. Foreign legations within the city would begin to become panicked. On the 13th of June, 1900, the Empress Dowager would declare the Boxers to be a patriotic movement, lending official support to the rebellion, and ordering that Qing forces not attempt to stop them. This would give the movement a great burst of legitimacy, and all the while, they would continue to advance, destroying foreign targets and infrastructure. Shortly thereafter, a German diplomat would be killed by the Boxers, and they would besiege the foreign legations in Beijing, now supported by Qing troops. Around 900 foreigners and 3,000 Chinese Christians would be trapped. The Empress would declare war on the foreign powers, and call for all Chinese to aid in this endeavor. In July and August of that year, European forces would assemble in Tianjin. Initially, a relief column would be pushed back. However, a larger force of around 55,000 troops would be assembled. Britain, Russia, Japan, France, Germany, the United States, Italy, and Austria-Hungary would form an 8-nation alliance to fight against the Boxers and the Qing. They would further gain the support of the Netherlands, Spain, Belgium, and a defensive pact of southeastern Chinese governors who sided with the Europeans over the Qing. They would set forth from Tianjin, destroying Qing forces as they made their advance, entering Beijing on August 14th of 1900. The troops would occupy Beijing, and the Empress and the Emperor Guangxu would flee to Xi'an. For the next year, the Qing and the Allied forces would negotiate a settlement. A final treaty would be agreed upon in September of 1901. This agreement would instantiate the Boxer Protocol. The Qing would be required to pay the equivalent of around $330 million at the time in silver. The Chinese would be required to destroy forts and allow foreign troops in Beijing. They would as well need to officially apologize, punish officials, and erect statues to foreign victims of the rebellion. Troops would occupy Beijing and Tianjin until 1902, while Russians would occupy Manchuria. The enormous indemnities imposed on the Chinese would cause great economic damage. The massive silver payments would cause a tremendous strain on the government. Yet more than that, the perception of legitimacy which remained with the Qing was so extraordinarily degraded that the conditions for the end of the dynasty were beginning to emerge. Between 100 and 200,000 had been killed. They faced an enormous economic burden. Foreign control was tightening, and the Qing appeared weak. In the first decade of the 1910s, early stock exchanges would emerge in Shanghai. Banking networks were secretly maintaining the opium trade, and particularly from British finance via Hong Kong. The British banking empire was looking to drain China. It had brought China through the process of war and buyout, and now the Chinese looking around, seeing a non-viable government, foreign control over their wealth and prosperity, an impossible level of constant debt, and foreign military and financial domination. The nationalist movements would only grow. However, another China would become quite evident as well. Particularly in areas around Shanghai and Hong Kong, there was a clear second China who sought to align themselves with the foreign powers and foreign finance. This is a theme that will re-emerge over the following century. By this point, many blamed the Qing for China's woes, a sentiment which converged with anti-Manchu sentiment, seeing that a foreign people ruling over them had brought them to this state of ruin. Revolutionary movements were beginning to re-emerge, and this would grow as economic conditions worsened and famines would become more frequent. Following the death of the emperor and the empress dowager, the emperor's 2-year-old nephew Puyi would take the throne, with his father Prince Chun acting as regent. Many of the more traditionalists within the court would oppose the actions of the regent, and this would only increase sentiment for revolution. Revolutionary organizations were beginning to coalesce. Groups like the China Revival Society, the Restoration Society, and the Elder Brother Society would form the backbone of a revolution. One towering figure in this endeavor was Sun Yat-sen, a nationalist revolutionary. He would form multiple revolutionary organizations and unify some of the most substantial together into the Tongmenghui, the United League. In the decade leading up to 1911, numerous uprisings of these revolutionary groups would be attempted. However, for the time being, it appeared as though the Qing was capable of keeping them down. Yet regardless, the revolutionaries were committed, and they did not stop. In September of 1911, members of the revolutionary groups, the Literary Society, and the Progressive Association, along with elements of the Qing New Army, would hold a conference in Wuchang, identifying the location as a headquarters for the revolution. Under the leadership of Jiang Yiwu and Sun Wu, they would plan an uprising for October 6th of that year. The uprising was to include revolutionary groups, as well as elements from within the Qing military itself. The revolutionaries would build bombs, and planned to use them in an overthrow of the Qing. Yet in October, when some of the bombs would go off accidentally, the Qing viceroy would set out to have the revolutionaries captured. Realizing that they could wait no longer, the revolutionaries decided to launch their uprising without any further delay. A revolt would be launched on October 10th of 1911. This time, the uprising was very successful, with the revolutionaries successfully capturing Wuchang by October 11th. They would announce a new military government and the establishment of the Republic of China. Over the following week, uprisings would erupt across China. By the end of October, 15 provinces had declared themselves to be independent from Qing. On November 9th of 1911, revolutionary delegates from the provinces would elect Sun Yat-sen to be the provisional president of the Republic of China. On December 25th, he would arrive in Shanghai, hailed as the leader of the revolution. The scale of the revolt was enormous, with so much of China declaring itself to be independent of Qing. There was very little that the Qing could do. Their entire government had simply fallen apart. On January 1st of 1912, Sun would be inaugurated as the provisional president. This would be the start date of the Republican calendar. From here, the new revolutionary government would seek out negotiations with the Qing. Sun would offer to the commander of the Beiyang army, Yuan Shikai, that he would resign if he could force the Qing emperor to abdicate. And on February 12th of 1912, the Emperor Puyi would abdicate, ending the Qing Dynasty. As promised, Sun would resign, and on February 15th, Yuan Shikai would be elected as provisional president by the Nanjing Assembly. He would consolidate power in Beijing, and on the 11th of March, a temporary constitution would be adopted, enshrining a parliamentary system in China. The following month, the capital would be formally moved to Beijing, and the dominance of Yuan and the Beiyang clique would be solidified. Sun would reorganize the Revolutionary Alliance into the Kuomintang, China's nationalist party, while Yuan would suppress opposition, dissolve parliament, and from 1915 to 1916 declare himself to be emperor. Under Yuan's dictatorship, opium would be once again banned. Modernization efforts, including the New Culture movement, would advocate for science, a democratic system, and for the adoption of vernacular language. The start of the new government and the dictatorship of Yuan would be a quite turbulent time for China, yet many did believe that this could be a time of positive change, with a new prosperity on the other side. Yet around this time, a new global crisis would emerge, one which would draw the attention of the European powers away from China. In 1914, the First World War would commence. The war that raged in Europe was unlike anything that humanity had ever seen. The raw scale and destruction of mechanized warfare between the great powers of Europe showed humanity a darkness that it did not yet know existed. It showed what man was capable of. It showed the horrors that could be drawn out of all of us. And it signified the beginning of a new era for humanity. Due to the sheer level of resources required, the Europeans would draw their focus away from Asia, dedicating themselves to the continent. As a result of this, the opium supply would be badly disrupted in China, an outcome which may not have been good for the merchants, but did loosen some of the strangulation which opium still had over the Chinese. At the same time, internal crisis was rising in Russia, and the Japanese were industrializing and militarizing more and more. The Chinese would initially declare themselves to be neutral in the war. However, the powerful Japanese, who had aligned themselves with Britain, would ignore this neutrality, invading the German-leased Qingdao and Shandong. The Japanese would defeat the Chinese quite easily, and they would deliver a list of 21 demands. If accepted, the demands would give the Japanese a great deal of control in China, and it would fully enshrine Japanese control over the lands that they had taken. Unable to find any other avenue out, the Chinese would accept most of the demands. The Chinese felt humiliated at this, with acceptance of the Japanese demands coming to be known as National Humiliation Day. All the while, as the scale of the war was rising, China's attempts at neutrality were becoming more strained. Though they wouldn't enter as direct combatants, around 140,000 Chinese would be recruited by the Western powers, particularly the United Kingdom and France, to act as laborers on the Western Front. They would provide a great deal of service to the war effort, and many would die from accidents or disease. Yet the Chinese were still unwilling to fully enter into the war. In February of 1919, a German U-boat would sink a French vessel, which had many Chinese crewmen aboard, killing over 500 of the Chinese. In March, China would formally cut diplomatic ties with Germany, and on August 14, 1917, following internal dispute, China would declare war on Germany and Austria-Hungary. China would send more and more laborers to the Western Front. However, they still would not send troops. This period would see internal power struggles, profound economic disruption from the war, and a sense of humiliation from the defeat at the hands of the Japanese. And though they didn't send troops, the sheer scale of the Chinese labor force which went into the war proved to be quite instrumental. On November 11th of 1918, an armistice agreement would be reached, paving a way for the end of the First World War, and by June 28th of 1919, the Paris Peace Conference would result in the Treaty of Versailles, ending the war. One of China's expectations for becoming formally involved in the war was the return of Shandong from the Japanese. However, following the Treaty of Versailles, Japan would retain the land. As a result, China would refuse to sign on. Massive protests would erupt in Beijing over the course of May. The resulting May 4th movement would spark nationalism, a sort of cultural, intellectual awakening, solidifying the new Chinese identity. This environment would also begin to see the emergence of Marxist elements, creating an environment that would lead to the formation of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921. These years had seen enormous internal conflict, and once again, China was at a crossroads. Going into the 1920s, the country was functionally divided between regional warlord cliques, with centralized authority not functionally relevant. Hyperinflation was causing widespread economic devastation, and the instability had led to a state of crisis for the Chinese. Sun Yat-sen had come to the belief that the only way forward for China was to unify militarily. He and his nationalist base would begin cooperating with the CCP. The first united front would be formed, with momentum for unification rising, and he and the Kuomintang would seek out support from the Soviets. He would propose regional non-interference for the warlord leaders, and gaining men and support, begin a campaign of conquest to the north. From 1926 to 1928, Kuomintang-led unification efforts would gain traction, with the armies sweeping through China. The National Revolutionary Army would be led by Chiang Kai shek, and they would be quite successful, capturing Shanghai in March of 1927. Chiang was rising in the Kuomintang, asserting himself not only as a military leader, but a political one. As the Nationalists were solidifying their grip across China, Chiang would begin a purge of communists. Retrospectively, this period of purging would be known to the communists as the White Terror. The CCP would be driven underground, and in 1928, Chiang Kai-shek would establish a nationalist government in Nanjing. China had been, at least nominally, unified under the Kuomintang, and this period of nationalist leadership would be known as the Nanjing Decade. Under the Nationalists, centralization would become a key goal, with many efforts to centralize the fractured China carried out in the 1920s and 30s. Some of the warlords would revolt. However, the Nationalists would prove that they had the ability to clamp down on them. Chiang would demonstrate an ability to maintain control, a demonstration which would increase his legitimacy. Beginning in the early 1930s, the New Life movement would begin, with Chiang attempting to revive Confucian values for China. The nationalist government was focused on rekindling a sense of national identity, combining modernization and growth with a reassertion of the traditional values and beliefs that had made China great in the past. There would be some great successes, and centralization would commence. However, globally, the 1930s was a time of great difficulty as the Great Depression spread across the world. In 1934, the United States had passed the Silver Purchase Act. This would lead to a rapid increase in the price of silver. As a result, there would be massive outflows of silver from China, leading to rapid currency appreciation. As a result, China would enter a period of severe deflation and economic contraction. The Chinese would be forced to abandon their silver standard. Economic conditions were once again worsening, and though the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek had solidified power, the Marxist elements persisted, and particularly in rural areas. In 1931, Mao Zedong would establish the Jiangxi Soviet. Kuomintang and Chinese communist forces would begin to clash. Particularly as famines hit rural areas of China, the message of the CCP would spread, and they would gain ranks. The Nationalists would use military force in an effort to squish them down. For a while, this would appear successful, with the Kuomintang frequently forcing large retreats on the part of the communists. There would increasingly be student protests, The Nationalists would aim to solidify their support, while the underground Communists would spread their message and seek to grow their ranks outside of the purview of the nationalist government. As conflict was rising, a civil war had emerged. The civil war would escalate, and it would appear as though the Communists and Nationalists would once again plunge China into a major internal war. However, all the while, a new threat was rising. In September of 1931, Japan had invaded Manchuria. Over the following year, Japan would establish a puppet state, solidifying its control over the territory. At this point, Japan had become quite a sizable industrial, economic, and military force. They were seeking to create a pan-Asiatic empire, and their efforts appeared to be succeeding. The Chinese could not stand against the Japanese at this point, for while the Chinese had been economically devastated and internally divided, the Japanese had become a real power, perhaps the only true great one outside of Europe and the United States. It was a true peer competitor to the other great empires of the world, and China just could not match that. Manchuria would lose its heavy industry under the Japanese, and this imposition of Japanese force would lead to boycotts and a nationwide rise of anti-Japanese sentiment. In January of 1932, Japan would attack Shanghai. It was becoming more and more evident the threat that the Japanese posed to China, and over the following years as the Japanese threat grew, conflict between the Nationalists and the Communists would continue. In 1933 and 1934, the Fifth Encirclement Campaign would force a strategic retreat of the Communists. Around 100,000 Communist Red Army troops would retreat from the Jiangxi Soviet to Yan'an, 6,000 miles away. It was an enormous retreat, and at the moment, it appeared as though the Nationalist Army had the advantage. This enormous 6,000-mile retreat would become known as the Long March, and of the 100,000 who had began, only around 8,000 would survive by the end. And though the Civil War was heating up to be a very serious conflict between the Nationalists and Communists, the threat that the Japanese posed would quite clearly show to be a larger threat that demanded cooperation. Beginning toward the end of 1936, a second united front would be formed. Kuomintang and Red Army forces would unite, creating a unified Chinese force to stand in opposition to the Japanese. The Chinese still had not recognized the Japanese state in Manchuria, and all the while, the Japanese were increasing their forces in China. On July 7, 1937, Japanese units stationed at Fengtai crossed the border into Chinese territory to conduct military exercises. While much of the events that followed are still shrouded in the fog of war, Japanese and Chinese forces outside of Wanping, around 10 miles outside of Beijing, exchanged fire. A Japanese soldier, Private Shimura Kikujiro, failed to return to his post, and the Japanese set out to search for him. The Chinese regimental commander, Ji Tianwen, received a message from the Japanese demanding permission to enter Wanping to search for the private. The Chinese would refuse this demand, and yet later that night, the soldier would return, claiming that he had gotten lost. By this point, both the Chinese and Japanese were mobilizing, and the Japanese would deploy reinforcements to surround Wanping. That night, Japanese infantry would attempt to breach Wanping's defensive walls, yet be repulsed by the Chinese forces. 2 hours later, the Japanese issued an ultimatum, demanding entry, which the Chinese refused. Both the Chinese and Japanese would order their troops on high alert, and the following day, on July 8th, Wanping's mayor would go to the Japanese camp to negotiate, yet the negotiations would fail. The Japanese would continue their demand to enter the town to investigate the cause of the incident, all while both sides gathered more reinforcements. As the mayor was returning from negotiations, he witnessed Japanese forces amassing around the town, and within 5 minutes of his return to the city, a first shot was heard. Both sides would open fire, and the Battle of Beiping-Tianjin would commence. This would prove to be the first battle of the Second Sino Japanese War. one of the wars of the Second World War. The Sino Japanese War would be particularly brutal. Shanghai would fall in 1937. The deaths, suffering, brutality, and economic devastation would be on an entirely new level. In December of 1937, Chinese and Japanese troops had been engaged in a fierce battle for control over Nanjing, yet the Japanese had successfully taken the surrounding areas, conducting widespread slaughter, torture, and brutality along the way. As they pressed forth into the city, the Japanese would face sporadic fighting from decentralized pockets of Chinese resistance. The Japanese would be ordered to kill all of the Chinese soldiers which they could find. However, since it was quite difficult to figure out who were the Chinese soldiers, the Japanese instead decided to just kill all of the men and young. They would organize a protocol for massacres, killing as many young people as possible in the shortest period of time that they could manage. The sheer scale of devastation afflicted by the Japanese military has become one of the most resounding chapters of national trauma that has formed the modern Chinese identity. There were no limits to the cruelty of the Japanese. The Japanese were fanatic, ideological, and believed so much in the inferiority of the Chinese that their sadism had a deep eros all its own. Over these years of the Sino-Japanese War, the nationalist government would relocate to Chongqing, while the CCP would base itself in Yangon. The country would be devastated by sheer physical destruction, mass death, and hyperinflation as their economy collapsed. As the 1940s began, the front lines would begin to stabilize. The conflict would begin to shift to guerrilla warfare. Japan would control the eastern cities and coasts, yet were unable to successfully conquer the interior. The war would become one of attrition, where Allied nationalist and communist forces would engage in decentralized, atypical warfare to repulse the Japanese. All the while, the CCP continued their campaign of garnering support in rural, liberated areas. The Chinese would be in close contact with the Allied powers. As they were quite clearly against the Japanese, they aligned themselves with the Anglo-American, French, and Russian cause. China would send around 140,000 laborers to support the Allies in Europe. Similar to the First World War, these would be non-combat roles, yet would lend a great deal of support, and would suffer losses all the same. They would mount valiant defenses against the Japanese, and demonstrated that they were able to maintain the interior, though the loss of the coasts would mean substantial economic loss. In December of 1941, the Japanese would attack United States Navy assets in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Shortly thereafter, China would formally declare war on Japan, Germany, and Italy on December 9th. This would make China one of the official Allied powers. The United States would provide military aid to the Chinese, supplies, and the American Volunteer Corps, the Flying Tigers. And later on, the United States Army Air Forces would directly support China. Beginning in 1942, Japanese forces would occupy Burma, cutting off the Burma Road, which was China's main supply route. The Allies would build the Lido Road to reopen supplies for China. Quite often the conflict in China is something which isn't well known in the West. Yet not only was its scale and devastation immense, but tactically and logistically, it was a very significant theater of the war. 1944 would see Operation Ichigo, Japan's last major offensive in China. They would capture major Chinese cities and threaten Chongqing, afflicting heavy losses on the Chinese. Yet ultimately, they were unable to destroy the Nationalist Army. The Chinese had once again stood their ground. Beginning on August 6, 1945, the United States would drop atomic bombs on Japan, leading to the final stages of the war. And on the same day as the second bomb, beginning August 9, 1945, the Soviet Union would declare war on Japan and invade Manchuria, crushing the Japanese army. Japan would ultimately surrender on the 15th, with a formal surrender being signed on the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945. In the treaty, China would regain Taiwan, Manchuria, and additional territories that had been lost to the Japanese. The scale of the Sino-Japanese War in the Second World War was staggering. Between military and civilian, there are estimated to be around 14 to 20 million Chinese dead. Tens of millions were displaced. The economic and infrastructure damage was truly enormous, devastating the entire country, which was already precarious to begin with. The conflict would as well damage the perceived legitimacy of the nationalist government, beginning to shift the internal conflict for the communists. Yet China would as well be granted a permanent UN Security Council seat. China had stood its ground and had proven itself, and now it was on the winning side of the war that would define the next century. Modern Chinese identity would assert itself and begin to solidify into something that's recognizable today. And all the while, the Yang'an-based CCP would survive and expand its presence. Yet as the Sino-Japanese War came to an end, the Chinese quickly had to turn their attention to the unresolved conflict. And so, as the devastation of one conflict came to an end, the Chinese Civil War would begin.